It took you a rather circuitous path to learn that language that you call your language now. Can you talk a little bit about how you... Can we do anything about this, the kind of funny sounds of mics?
It's a lot of mid-range
Yeah. We can talk.
Can we take some 8K out?
We can talk really low. Quiet. Maybe up here. Oh yeah. My God, hang on. Level. Might be right on here. See, here's a foreign little thing.
Yeah, I don't see.
This is more like union gear. So,
did you find a level?
no.
I just turned
You did.
The language in the studio too. First, I'll tell you guys, because this is a music industry forum, and I happen to be in the section of the music industry that is recording and making records. But it didn't start out that way. I started out as a secretary I started out working in a record store in a little town in Illinois. And I started out with a 4-track, of course, and I started out going to see bands and clubs and sneaking up to Chicago. And but something about the person, and it was always a guy at that point, who was over by the soundboard, it was always really appealing to me, mostly because I thought, well, that person gets their own space without all the drunk, nasty people everywhere around them, and they're in the center, and they must hear very well, and they've got perfect visual, and I thought, I want to kind of stand in there to see the show, because that seems to be the optimum place to see the show, and little thoughts would occur to me on who is that person. But nonetheless, I did start as a secretary in a record company because they wouldn't hire me in the studio where I applied. And I worked my way up through Capitol Records to become a marketing manager. I had an expense report and a company car and a space in the, not the main executive lot, but the secondary executive lot, which was a big deal. And a little office in that round building. And I learned a lot in working in the record business, working at a label that actually was very relevant later when I had to become the producer on a record and turn in budgets and be responsible for money that was being provided. The label can be vilified very quickly, and often should be, but underneath, we romanticize the music business, all of us do, I certainly still do. The music business, there's nothing wrong with it. Someone asked me that once, what's wrong with the music business? And I thought, well, nothing, because they're underneath all of the nice labels and the romanticizing is a high-powered money-making machine that wants to make money. And so it functions beautifully in that capacity. It makes money. And we need their money to make records. Less now, because people have studios in their basements and access to Pro Tools, and anybody can record their own record. But certainly when I started, that wasn't the case. You had to go to a studio and they were expensive, and somebody had to give you that money. And so it was this machine that gave that money. And but there's good and bad in everything, and the music business in and of itself isn't inherently evil. It's just that there's a lot of money that's funneled into one individual becoming a pop star, and a lot of other individuals that could use just a little piece of that money get none. However, if you want to make music for a living, get ready and just do it. I mean, you may or may not succeed. You may or may not succeed making records. I'm a success. I'm a success in my own mind because I get to make a living doing this, but I've never made $1 million. I don't have, I don't demand, millions of dollars to make a record. I will still go in and work for $500 if that's what you have. And anyway, I'm rambling. Next.
Can we give everything you're saying is wonderfully important, and it's very interesting because last week we had an artist who was signed to Capitol here. The perceptions that we all have regarding record labels, all different are all different because of our different relationships to those labels. I ran one. I had a perspective of it. You work with them not in the capacity of an artist, but as someone who used to be an employee of a label, and then work with them as a quasi-employee, as a producer, and you have a different perspective, and the artist has a completely different perspective. So I think it's wildly instructive to talk to these people that are all getting ready to engage in that world in one capacity or another and see that it is a different perspective. But you kind of left off on your story about how you were working at Capitol and marketing, I think, and it seems like an interesting path to get from there to where you are now.
Well, I wanted to get into the studio, and I would hang around in the studio. I would hang around outside the hallway that led to the studio, and I would wait until there was an opportunity for the maintenance man, Mr. Jackson, who's still there, an elderly fellow, who, once things really shut down and there might be somebody in the mix room, he would actually let me into Studio A to look at it.
Can you give us some context of Studio A, Capitol Building? What records might have been made there?
Well, at that point I didn't really know, but I knew that it was one of the, I didn't really even know what it meant to go into Studio A, except for that it meant that I was in Studio A. But Frank Sinatra and Miles Davis and like great artists from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Beach Boys, you know, for all I know, the Beatles may have passed through there, but it was a famous room, and I knew that, but I didn't know why it was famous. I didn't know what made it famous. I didn't know that the Neve console in there, that was one of the first that Rupert Neve had ever made custom for that room, and it was signed by Rupert Neve. I later got to work on that console, and Al Schmidt, another very successful, eminently successful engineer, signed it too, and I thought, I'm going to grab me a Sharpie. Trina Shoemaker. But I would sneak into Studio A with Al and the cleaning guy, and in my life specifically, control rooms were very, very appealing to me, far more appealing than actually being on stage, which I am right now, because right now I feel a little nervous, I'm starting to sweat. And right, so that wasn't that appealing. I grew up in a strange context where my dad worked in a control room, but not an audio control room. He worked for Midwestern Gas in the natural gas industry. His control room was underground. It was a closed room, not unlike this, no windows. There were a lot of meters and valves and knobs, and it was quiet. You controlled the light with big knobs like you do in a studio. And I found comfort there, and as an adult I realized that I recreated to a certain degree a zone of control. I mean, I am a control freak. There's no question about that.
Do you have to be a good engineer?
Absolutely. You absolutely do, but you have to know when to stop controlling. I'm easy to please. If I can control the lighting, the level of the music, and the sound, I'm happy. I don't want to control an artist's music. I don't want to control their lyrics. I don't want to control their music or their parts. I want to control how loud it is. I want to control how the track sheets are organized. I want to control the Sharpie supply. I want to be in control of the strip of tape. I don't want anybody else's writing on it, ever. My assistants all know that now. Don't fill it out, let her. I like to look at my own writing. You have to know when to stop controlling, but you do have to be very, very organized to be in there. I know there are a lot of women out here today who are probably in the recording program and are wondering, you know, what's going to happen, what that's like, and sexism and all those questions. They're not really relevant. I'm only now starting to realize what it's going to mean to be a woman in the recording industry, because now I'm going to have a baby, and I actually have to be pregnant and have the baby. Therefore, I have to not go into the studio because you can't bend over. Okay, there. Number one, if you're pregnant and you're an engineer, you can't bend over after a certain amount of time. Your feet swell, so you can't sit for a certain amount of time, so I'm having to remove myself a little bit from the studio. Once the baby's born, he's going to come with his mama or his daddy to the studio, and I'm going to set up an ISO booth as the nursery, and I'm going to boom a microphone above him. And it's going to be on a meter, and then I'll know. It's true.
No, as a new father, that's a wonderful idea.
So, I mean, you're not going to be limited as long as you are able to lift. You're going to be required to lift amplifiers, wrap cables. It's a strenuous, physically exhausting work.
So going from the... I'm kind of...
Once again, so there I am,
No.
standing outside the hall
Yes.
at the studios of Capitol Records. And we had...
I'm not devaluing the other expository
you
things. I'm
will
just
have
trying
to
to
stop
kind
me. I went to a marketing meeting. I was 24 years old. I had done, maybe 23, very, very well. I did not go to college because something inside me made me get in a car instead at 18 and drive myself to California and get a job at a record company. Anyway, I went to a marketing meeting, and the director of marketing, they were all fighting in there, all these executives, all these extremely high-paid executives, about why the Great White Record didn't sell as well as
For those of you who don't know, Great White was a band.
a band
Yes.
in the 80s.
And maybe, I guess
band.
we can generously
Right.
call them a band. That
A
maybe-
band. Why their record didn't sell as much as Def Leppard's Pyromania. And I just said, the Great White Record sucks, and Pyromania is it's a very cool record. Have you guys not listened to it? And I was really reprimanded for making that comment later by the head of marketing, and I was just like, but wait a second, this is a fact. We're arguing here over why one record didn't sell and the other did, but one's a great record and one isn't. You guys don't listen to music. And at that moment, I thought, I'm in the wrong business. This is a mistake. I want to be in the studio. They won't hire me. In the 80s, I was told by all the major studios they didn't hire women. A&M went so far as to tell me that women would be a distraction in the control room. And all I kept thinking is, like, I'm not that beautiful. I'm really not. And if I was, I could see this, but I'm just pretty, I'm okay looking. I'm fine. But anyway, so I quit my job one day. I walked into Ron's office and I quit. And I sold everything that I owned and I moved to London. And I got a cold water flat in a basement in a nasty part of London. And I worked as a barmaid again. And I was a failure at 24 as far as I was concerned. And then a manager from my days back at Capitol came into the bar to get drunk and said, "What are you doing here, love?" And I said, I'm going to be a barmaid now in London. And he was leaving his office for 6 months to come to America to work on a movie that would be called Home Alone. This man's name is Tarquin Gosh. He's a very famous producer of movies. And he was an artist manager then. And he asked me if I would come and run his label, or his management office, rather, in London for 6 months. And I thought, well, that's me being a record company secretary again, but I need some money, and I'm cold, and I'm hungry, and I'm afraid. So I moved into his apartment. He left me to run his little office, and in the basement of that office was an artist named Hugh, who had a studio. And he had a little Tascam board and a Tascam 16-track tape machine, and a computer with Cubase on it, which is way long gone. And I said to him, I want to be an engineer, don't laugh. And he said, "Lou, start punching after I say, put the finger here. I can't do the English accent. Nonetheless, he said, punch my vocals then tonight, and taught me how to punch vocals. And I didn't even know what that language was, punch vocals. I didn't know what patch cables were. I knew really nothing. But I'm over the valley, don't I breathe, wait.
It's Spinal Tap.
Right, well, it wasn't, it's all punching, but I'm
Derek
learning how to punch. Right, it's all, that's
Sid Vicious
but he was
or
a real,
Nigel Tufnell.
he was this gorgeous Jamaican, big spliff hanging out of his mouth, and he was signed to Capitol. So here I am on the backside, punching these vocals in the basement, and I'm really frightened at that point, but I'm learning how to punch and how to do this thing, and I'm engineering. And he's the one who told me, you're great, your sense of sound is awesome, it's so natural and it's so unruined.
How important was it to hear someone tell you you were great at that point?
I could attribute the entire reason that I'm here right now to Hugh Harris, he knows it. He just looked at me and he said, you are an engineer, you're fantastic at this, you can do this. And I worked with him for months in his basement. He taught me all kinds of things. I'm like, I got my books, I'm like, amplitude, I don't understand this word. He said, so volume, low, little needle, volume. Right, amplitude is volume.
And now you're monitoring your
Right.
baby with this.
Yes, so anyway, he went on tour with Sinead. Tarquin came back, and I left, and I hitchhiked from Amsterdam to Istanbul, and I just wandered the globe for a little while. And then I got back to Los Angeles, broke, and thought, okay, I want to be an engineer. Went to the studios again, but they still didn't hire women in the 80s in Los Angeles, so I went to a little recording school, learned how to do tape machine alignment, and once again found myself very poor and lost. And then I was temping at Capitol, which was very humiliating because I had left as an executive and came back as a temp. And and I got on a plane in the middle of the night and I flew to New Orleans and I didn't know a soul here. And I stayed at a little, I went to the Hummingbird as my first place when I got to town, which was a mistake. You guys might not remember this place, but believe me, it was harsh. And then I found a little place in the French Quarter that I rented for a week, and I applied at every studio in New Orleans. I got hired as a maid at Ultrasonic. And then my career began. And I started learning how to record music. But again, there was no Pro Tools then. If there was, it was in its infancy. And I learned how to make patch cables, how to build patch bays, how to recap the electrolytic capacitors on modules and consoles. And I worked all day, every day. I temped in the morning as a typist for a temp firm, data processed. And then at noon I got off, so I worked from 6 till noon typing. And then I would go to either Ultrasonic, and I also lied at Muddy Waters. And so that I was a very successful live sound engineer out in LA, and I did some live sound there. And but I worked for free in studios in the afternoons, and I bartended at night. And so I worked all the time, and I worked 14 to 20 hours a day, every day, for really what was my entire 20s. I got some breaks too. But all that it will be your own personal story, because everybody will have a different way that they find their way in. Those ridiculous commercials that are just do it for the right reasons, it does matter what your intention is. Wanting to be rich and famous is extremely valid. Wanting to be an artist is very valid. Wanting to be the person who's heard and seen is just as valid as the person who wants to be the control freak behind the thing going, doing the knobs. Wanting to be the artist, but you can't sort of want to be both. You have to choose at one point, I'm either going to be the engineer or a producer, or I'm going to be the artist. You will get to be both later, but initially it's better just to pick one or the other and focus on it. Because sitting in a studio as an engineer when you wish you were the guitar player will make you bitter and unpleasant to be around. I didn't want to be the guitar player or the singer. Luckily, I didn't want to sleep with the guitar player either. That was helpful.
Did you want to be, you began this discussion with saying that there's really no distinction between a producer and and I understand. But, in many studio scenarios, there is a producer and an engineer.
Right.
Did you want to be the producer?
No.
Can you elaborate on that a little? I mean, I think that there may be some, maybe there isn't, but there may be some gray areas between, okay, so what is the producer doing, what is the engineer doing? And I only bring this up because I think it is still very prevalent in the industry now.
It changes a lot. If you come into the studio as an artist first and you're going to produce another artist, then your language with that artist will be all musical. I started out as an engineer by default. I knew that I wanted to have control of the equipment in the room. It was as simple as that. I wanted to control the volume. I wanted to control the panning. I mean, I specifically wanted to control these very tactile aspects of music. It wasn't vague. It wasn't like, I think I want to control some particles in the universe. I thought, I want to pan that piano.
Did you care what the music was?
No.
It could have been
Def
Leppard or Great White.
Yeah, it could have been either one. I wanted to know, when I was young, I would put on headphones back in the days of just the simple hi-fi. And I couldn't believe how things were over here and here and here and here. And the scope of panning, I desperately wanted to pan music as kind of plain as that sounds. I wanted to control presence. And I wanted to be left alone. So if I could sit in that chair as an assistant, I knew it. If I could just sit there and be left alone with the volume out, the producer could be right there saying, blah, 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 blah. But if I could act it out, I could, it's a very physical thing for me in there. Again, it's not ambiguous. It's not, it's not like, I actually get physically involved with the console, and so the engineer was the right place for me to be. I wasn't a songwriter then. I didn't play instruments. I do now. But then I didn't, so I certainly didn't want to have to interact with an artist musically. I knew I felt music deeply,
What made you start playing instruments? I mean, is that an important?
Well, I actually secretly played instruments the whole time,
What-
but I was very, very shy about it. I did not want to be, I didn't want to be noticed for that. I just wanted to inside think, oh, I know I know what note you mean to hit. And when the time came, I'd be able to say, you need to go to that note. And I'd be able to mimic them so that I'd been mimicking everybody the whole time, running home. And I still am very secretive about music that's inside of me. I have no idea why. It's my private world, extraordinarily private. But I needed to first be very confident that with an artist I could talk the language of music before I started blurting out what I thought should go in the B section.